So Jim is married to Christine, and you also have three grown-up children. So I assume that if you want to be part of speaking to the YLGs, you have to have three grown-up children first. Jim, you're from Britain, but you live in Spain, and
That's right.
You've been doing church planting there, and you're also lecturing on European mission at Redcliffe College, and you're also a member of the international leadership of the European Christian Mission, and as well you are leading. I guess some of you heard about the impact groups, which is running in the Lausanne movement in Europe at the moment. If you haven't heard about it, you will hear a little bit more in the end, and it's a really exciting thing going on. And Jim is leading the team who is preparing all the materials for it really faithfully, and I've gotten to know you through that, and it's been a real blessing to get to know you and serve together with you and under you. So we're excited to have you here, and we're excited to listening a little bit of the state of Europe, what's going on. So here we go.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I've sent Evie a presentation. I don't need it, but if you'd like to have that running alongside what I'm saying, that might be useful to some people. So she's going to send that on the chat, I believe. It's been great to see your faces, and frankly, I was also, like Dave, really looking forward to being with you guys. The last YLG event that I was at 2 years ago in Budapest was such a personal blessing to me. The Connect group well, connected, I think is the only way to put it, really. And we carried on meeting after Budapest for the best part of the next year every month, and then met up again recently on a one-off. So it's been very special. For me, that occasion was a real blessing. But I have to admit a certain degree of discomfort with the title that I've been given for today. Of course, I could have changed it, but I decided rather than do that, I would surf on the title and use it as a learning point. The issue, of course, I have is with the word trends. Now, a trend line is something that's drawn on a chart to connect two or more data points to indicate a direction of travel. And we often think that we can extrapolate out from existing data points and imagine the future. Hence the title, Trends in Europe and How We Should Respond. But the problem is, history teaches us that the really significant moments, the changes that truly change the world, can't be predicted by any trend line. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book. It's called Black Swan. Before the discovery of Australia, Europeans were convinced that all swans were white. There were thousands of data points to support that idea. All their previous travels around the world had confirmed that idea until they discovered the first black swan. Of course, initially they said, well, it can't be a swan, it must be some other sort of bird. But eventually they checked it out and it was a swan that was black. No trend line could possibly have predicted the existence of a black swan. And Nicholas Taleb's book is really all about the unexpected and unpredictable events that have had an extraordinary impact on our world. If you think about it, even if you've forgotten most of your history classes at school, there are certain years which are burned into our memories as Europeans. 1914, the start of the Great War. 1945, World War II. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. 2001, Twin Towers. 2008, the economic crisis. And now, the year that we are living in, 2020. This is a year that your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews will ask you about one day. Now, you can argue about whether a global pandemic was inevitable or in some ways predictable, but this year is a black swan. It is not just a gentle bend in the trend lines of what's happening in the world and in Europe. It is a completely new trend line, or even a jump onto a different line altogether. Of course, it might be a black swan to us, but it's no black swan to God. COVID was no surprise to him. There is no black swan for a sovereign God. We are, as Dave's reminded us, on a field trip to the future, but we are on one that we are not going to come back from. This is no field trip that we come back with our suitcases and tell our mum and dad how it's gone. This is a trip we're on, and we don't know where God's going to take us. Now, 2 years ago, when I presented at the YLG in Budapest, I presented a presentation under the title of Crises in Europe. And I suggested that it's helpful to look at Europe through 6 lenses to get an idea of what's going on. We need to look at Europe through a political lens, an economic lens, a social lens, an environmental lens, a technological lens, and a spiritual lens. And of course, that is still the case. There's huge value in doing that, even in your local situation, thinking about the practical and particular challenges and opportunities for the gospel in your situation viewed through those lenses. But I think COVID has disrupted things so much and accelerated change processes so much that we're actually facing quite new phenomena in some places. So I'm going to go through each of those again, highlighting a single issue and then saying something about how COVID has impacted it and how we might respond. Okay? So in some ways it might sound, well, he did that presentation 2 years ago. Why is he doing that? So it's not the same presentation at all. Okay? They're lenses that we're looking through again. You remember Dave's frame? Well, this is a bit like that too, where we're looking at the frame of life through these different lenses. In the political sphere, the trend that I highlighted back in 2018 was popular nationalism. Europe has a long history of problems with nationalism. In fact, in many ways, you could say the European Union was and is an attempt at restraining the ambitions of single nations as a way of avoiding the conflicts of the past. But nationalism is still there, bubbling under the surface in almost every European country. And within the recognized nation states, often there are autonomous or semi-autonomous regions which aspire to be nations in their own right. Now, the idea of a nation is a very powerful one because it gives people a sense of shared identity. Not a bad thing in itself, but all too often it defines who we are against others who we are not. And that plays out in all sorts of ways, whether in Brexit, Catalan independence conversations, Russian pretensions in the Ukraine, the current standoff between Poland and Hungary and the rest of the EU over the budget. Read about that today in the newspaper. Even the way different countries and regions have handled COVID. In Spain, where I live, COVID has provided yet more reasons for autonomous regions to set themselves against each other, and in particular against the government in Madrid. And many governments have brought in loads of powers under the guise of controlling the pandemic, increasing security measures, surveillance, curtailing liberties that previous generations have fought hard to win. So 2 comments in the way of response to that reality. First of all, that as Christians, we need to remember that the Christian gospel cuts right across nationalism, because our primary identity is not in the nation, but in Christ. As national and regional identities become ever more used as identity markers for belonging, the church of today and tomorrow needs to recover its prophetic voice that it had during the mid-20th century to challenge the false hope that popular nationalism is putting as a other gospel in some cases across Europe. Secondly, many of you will have grown up thinking that the Schengen area of border-free travel has and would always be there. It is very likely that we will never return to the same levels of freedom of movement that existed before the start of this year. International travel is likely to become ever more expensive and more burdensome. We're going to have tests when we cross borders, departure and arrival at airports, with all of the impact that that's going to have on Christian mission, short-term trips, long-term cross-cultural mission mobilization, and so on. The implications of this are huge. That in the way of the national issue. Let's talk now a minute about the economic lens. If the key word when we look at Europe through the political lens is nationalism, the key word here is debt. As I'm sure all of you know, GDP, gross domestic product, is how economists measure the general health of an economy. It's a bit like your blood pressure. You don't want it to be too high or too low, and certainly not going up and down rapidly. Over the past 15 years, there have been 3 significant dips in gross domestic product. The first corresponded to the global financial crisis in 2008, when the European economy contracted by between 5 and 6%. The second was the sovereign debt crisis, when the governments of Greece and Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, and Italy had to go cap in hand to the European Central Bank for a bailout. That was around about a 2% contraction. COVID, though, in the spring of this year caused a 12% contraction in GDP, twice as deep as the 2008 recession. It recovered somewhat over the summer, but the second wave and the bringing in of further control measures, we're looking at a global recession, and certainly a recession in Europe, stretching well into 2021 and possibly beyond. But it's actually even worse than that, because the last few years of relative stability have only been possible because the European Central Bank has been pumping in huge amounts of money into the economy to keep it going. If we return to the blood pressure analogy, we've been having a regular blood transfusion every month. Now, the last few years, as I say, might have seemed stable, but that was only possible because the ECB was pumping in sometimes 30, sometimes 60, and at some points, 90 billion euro every month just to keep our economic blood pressure up. That is 100, 200 euros a month for every single Eurozone citizen. You don't need to be an economist to know that if you borrow 100 euros a month for every member of your family just to keep putting food on the table, something isn't quite right. And then COVID happened. Governments have had to borrow even more money just to try and preserve jobs and livelihoods. And I don't need to tell you guys how much of an impact that's already had on young people. Some sectors of employment have already almost completely disappeared. Hospitality, tourism, the airline industry, commerce have already seen huge layoffs. Unemployment may be an actual issue for some of you and possibly a future one. What should be our response then in this situation? Well, firstly, I think we do need to adjust to this new reality. We do need to adjust to the expectations, both as individuals and as countries. We can't just keep, forgive me for putting it in these terms, we can't keep borrowing from our unborn children and nephews and nieces to finance our lifestyles today. Jesus called us to a simple lifestyle. We also need to remember that the ones who are most affected by COVID are the most vulnerable. Its impact on mental health, its impact in numbers of food banks that have popped up on the elderly. And yes, there may be possibilities for us to consider creation of employment as a frontier for mission in the future. But this area of the economic challenges is something that we all need to be thinking about, not just for ourselves, but those around us as well. In the social area, there are 2 huge demographic trends. I did mention them last time, but again, I want to relate them to COVID. The first of those is migration. Over the last 50 years, there's been a massive reversal in the flows of migration. Europe used to be somewhere people migrated from. Now it's somewhere people migrate to. We receive around about 1 million migrants a year across the EU. But every corner of Europe is different. Some countries, of course, like France, Germany, and the UK, have seen their populations grow very much through this time. Others, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, have suffered very significant emigration. The 10 countries with the fastest shrinking populations in the world are all in Europe. Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Moldova, Ukraine, Croatia, Romania, Serbia, Poland, and Hungary. All of that, those countries have lost more than 10% of their population over the last 25 years. And migration is one reason for collapsing populations, but the other is our reluctance to have children as Europeans. Across Europe, not a single European state has a birth rate sufficient to maintain its population. And in some countries, the numbers are frighteningly low. We're having fewer children, and when we have them later in life. And that in turn drives migration, as we need migrants to work and pay our pensions. What are going to be the effects of COVID on those two trends then? Well, in the short term, COVID may slow regular migration because of the travel restrictions. But that hasn't stopped the 17,000 people who have arrived in the Canary Islands since the summer on small boats. The migration routes across the Mediterranean that used to take people into Lampedusa and into Greece are increasingly bringing people to Spain. And as for birth rate, the uncertainty around the future is likely to only suppress the birth rates of Europe further. Now, migration is one of the ways that God is growing his church in Europe, and we should do whatever we can to welcome the migrants in our midst. And when it comes to Christian migrants, go the extra mile, because some of them are God's missionaries to Europe. When it comes to children, though, the response is simple. We are a people of hope, and people of hope make families. So, as I said 2 years ago, in inverted commas, mission is about making babies too. The church grows through biological growth, not just through people becoming Christians. Fourthly, the environmental lens. Now, we're not talking much about global warming these days, but 18 of the 19 warmest years on record have been since the turn of the millennium. Many European countries have had severe heat waves in recent years, but extreme weather is not only limited to heat waves. Flooding and droughts have also become a regular problem across Europe. And then there is COVID. The connection between the emergence of new diseases like COVID and climate change and biodiversity is increasingly recognized. COVID is a wake-up call for broader environmental threats. And the thing about environmental factors is that they affect everyone. And that's certainly the case with COVID. COVID has affected everyone and everything. So the key word in this area is everything. God's kingdom is about everything. But God's purpose in Christ is to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross, Colossians 1:20. So whatever your job, whatever your career, whatever your situation, God wants to bring his kingdom there. And I think COVID is showing us again just how much life is interconnected, that mission involves everything. There is no sacred secular divide. You are an ambassador for the kingdom of reconciliation. So whatever you do, do it as for Christ himself. The technological lens. And 2 years ago, I talked briefly about some of the technological megatrends, the new technologies that are anticipated to be just around the corner. Many of those are already taking place, but what COVID has done has been to accelerate those developments, perhaps even more, to accelerate the adoption of existing digital technologies by most, if not all, of the population. As a mission leader, I've been using Zoom for about the last 3 to 4 years with meetings with colleagues. Now, thanks to COVID, even my mother-in-law knows what Zoom is. Nearly every church member I know has participated in a Zoom service of some kind. The processes of digitalization that might have taken years under normal circumstances have taken place in a matter of weeks. The crisis has forced us to be creative and innovative. Back in June, the Church of England reported that 17,000 online services were available on their website. But as an extraordinary amount of effort was put into providing online worship services in the early months, many churches celebrated the numbers of those following their services online. But so many people have found, and I'm using this word carefully, excarnated worship, a very pale shadow of the real thing, non-embodied worship, okay, is very unsatisfying. It's like decaffeinated coffee. Now, I have a decaf at 9 o'clock at night because if I don't, I won't be able to sleep. But I love my coffee with caffeine. I love my worship where I can feel my brother and sister next to me and I can hear their voice on the back of my head. That's what I yearn for. In the summer of this year, the Barna Institute in the US published research on the impact of COVID on church attendance. They found that 1/3 of Christians in the US were still and only attending their pre-COVID church. 1/3 had either switched churches or were participating in multiple church services. And 1/3 had stopped attending church altogether. I've got 3 kids, and that has been the experience of one of mine. She happened to be moving on from the city where she'd been studying and hadn't found a strong church to be part of. And she stopped being part of a regular church. Her family now is her church. And we're desperately trying to preach the gospel to her and hold her in the midst of this all. There were lots of stories about how many fantastic numbers of people were connecting up to worship services, more than were normally there, but it's not everyone's experience. Church is about relationships, trust in God and in each other, and rootedness in a local community. COVID has highlighted again just how important rootedness is in real relationships, in our locality where we live, in the communities that give our people, our lives meaning. That's an opportunity for the church. For the real church is the local church. But we need to embrace this moment and reorientate our energies from just providing replacement worship services to meeting the needs of the vulnerable in our communities who are most impacted by the pandemic and building transformational relationships in smaller groups as we're able to. Lastly, we need to look at Europe through a spiritual lens, of course. For each of the lenses, I've given you a word, okay? For the political lens, nationalism. For the economic lens, debt. For the social lens, demographics. For the environmental lens, everything. For the technological lens, acceleration. And when it comes to the spiritual lens, there's so much going on. I could just not do justice to it at all in one. I could talk about the rise of people who say they have no religion, the huge proportion of young people particularly who've been saying that more and more over the last few decades. I could talk about nominal Christianity, the significant number of adults and surprising percentages of young people who still continue to identify as Christians. Or I could talk about the 1 in 20 Europeans who identify as Muslim and the prospect of growth in that number, but also the startling number of Muslim background believers that are coming to faith around Europe. But whether we're faced with a convinced atheist, a nominal Christian, or a Muslim, I believe our place to begin in respect to our perspective should be the perspective of Christ, what he taught us. We read in Mark 6:34, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. People are people. All of us can catch COVID. All of us without Christ are like sheep without a shepherd. It's not my favorite worship song, but it does contain a fundamental truth. Everyone needs compassion, the kindness of a savior. As you see the multitudes with their faces covered with masks walk by, whatever their spiritual condition, whether they have faith, don't have faith, they all need compassion. Many of them have lost friends or relatives, or are struggling with mental health issues, or heartache, or separation from loved ones. So when you look through the spiritual lens, more than a label, think of people who need compassion. So there you have it. Not so much 6 trends as 6 words that serve as a challenge for reflection. Nominalism, debt, demographics, everything, acceleration, and people. But to finish, I want to share an image with you all. And I don't know whether that's possible for me well, I'll put it on the presentation. It's a painting by the Flemish painter Bruegel the Younger from 1626. It's a vision of Europe during the Little Ice Age. From the mid-14th to the mid-19th century, Europe experienced centuries of colder winters, which regularly saw all of the major rivers freeze over, like in the painting. It wasn't just a long winter, it was a long-lasting and far-reaching change in our circumstances in Europe, with political, economic, social, environmental, technological, and spiritual consequences that lasted for hundreds of years. The black swan of the COVID pandemic probably won't affect us for hundreds of years, but we will all remember 2020. And I think we will remember it not only as the year of COVID, but as the year that COVID began, rather like 1914 or 1945, the first year of COVID. Now, there's value in identifying trends and suggesting how we might respond to them. But this is not only a task for futurologists, people who can think into the future. This is a task for all of us, as Dave has reminded us. We are all having to think into tomorrow. We're all having to take that field trip into the future. And that's something that all of us need to be engaged in. So at the end, I want to give an unapologetic plug to the Lausanne Europe conversation and to the impact groups that we're trying to start across Europe. Part of the vision for that is precisely about listening to as many possible people as we can, to get as many people as possible engaged in a big conversation about what is needed in mission in Europe, in such a way that we hear those voices, those unheard voices of migrant church leaders, of young people, of women, and so many others whose voices are often not present in the debate. Europe is too diverse and too dynamic to just have a few people with a platform who can speak about what things are happening. God is doing things everywhere. He is working in your lives and your ministries in amazing ways. And I've loved hearing Dave's testimony today. I'm looking forward to hearing yours one day about your trip into the future as well. So I'm going to finish there. I've got some questions which I'm happy for you to discuss in the groups. Shall I put those on the chat? Okay.
Yes, please do that. Thank you very much, Jim. This is very inspiring and challenging, and gives a really good understanding of what is actually happening in Europe. And I think it challenges us as a church, as young leaders. Where's our place in this? What is God doing? We'll go into groups again, and Jim gave us some questions. So this group time will last for 20-25 minutes. We'll call you back at 21:25. So you have a bit more than 20 minutes, and do 2 things. Talk about those questions for half the time, and then take half of the time to pray for one another. Share, I really encourage you to share what is it that, please pray for me for this. Yeah. Okay, so Janet, go ahead and send us into the groups.